the Paranormal AF podcast. I'm your host, Rin, and today we are having another storytime episode. Today's story is a reportedly true tale of the paranormal that I found on Reddit, so I'll be telling you the story and then give you my thoughts on it. Please understand that while the OP claims this story to be true, I have no way to prove or disprove the OP's story. The purpose of these episodes will be entertainment and discussion. It is entirely up to you if you choose to believe the OP's story or not. I chose today's story because it makes me nostalgic for a type of ghost story I often heard growing up. I'm going to be real upfront with you. There's one or two details in particular that make me question if this story is true or not, but we will get into that in the discussion portion of the episode. I just want to be upfront with you that I find this one questionable, but I like the type of story. So let me just get into the story and see if you have the same questions that I did. The OP says, when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, Mike and I bought a house in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, in the middle of nowhere. We drove down winding roads for 40 minutes just to go grocery shopping, and most of our neighbors were only around in the summer or on holidays. It was a nice little house next to the creek, and in the kitchen, mounted on the wall, was an old-fashioned dial phone with a coiled cord. I object to her calling them old-fashioned, but that's neither here nor there. Back to the story. When we first moved in, I picked up the receiver and heard a quiet conversation between two women about hair dye. I didn't want to eavesdrop, so I said, "Hello? Who is this?" The ladies stopped talking. Then one said, "Did you hear that?" "Yes. Is someone there?" "Hi. Can you hear me?" I said. Then it was silent. No voices, just a faint dial tone. I quickly decided this old phone was somehow hooked up to an old-fashioned party line. After that, we used the phone very little, preferring our cordless phone hooked up in the other room. The handful of times I did use it, I could hear whispered voices in the background, always assuring the other person that the line sometimes picked up other calls. A year and a half passed, and we mostly forgot the phone was even there. Then, in September of 1999, Hurricane Floyd passed through our area, leaving us without power and the road with large, impassable trees blocking the way. Fortunately, we were already prepared. We had stored food and clean water in a paranoid frenzy for Y2K, and we desperately needed all of it. We bathed in the creek, painted in the day, and played board games by candlelight while waiting for our power to be restored. After a week, the road was clear, but still no power, and it was getting tedious for Mike and me, though 1-year-old Chloe was loving it. I lamented that we couldn't call my sister, as the cordless phone didn't work without electricity, when we heard an unfamiliar ring. It was the wall phone in the kitchen. I raced to it, and I heard the faint voice of my sister. She was just checking in on us and invited us up to her place until our power came on. So off we went for 5 days, and when we returned, everything was back to normal, and I was so glad we had a hardwired phone that didn't rely on electricity. A couple of years passed after the hurricane, and the phone was mostly ignored, except by 3-year-old Chloe, who thought it would look better covered in sparkly stickers. The power went out at least once or twice this summer, usually just for a few hours. During one of these outages, Mike decided to try the phone in the kitchen to make his phone call, but it was dead. Concerned, he drove up the road to the local country store and called AT&T's service line. I believe the conversation went something like this. "Hello, yes, my phone has stopped working." "Can I have your account number?" "Yes, it's insert account number here." "I don't see anything wrong here." "Well, we don't have any power right now." "Well, that would be the problem then." "No, but we have an old-fashioned dial phone hooked up in the kitchen. It should still work." I'm sorry, sir, but according to our records, you have no phone in the kitchen. Yes, we do. We've used it. No, you don't. If you do, it's not connected through us. Oh, okay. After Mike came home, he walked into the kitchen and pulled the phone off the wall. The only wire on it was about 3 inches long and attached to nothing. It was never hooked up. End of OP's story. As I state in all of these Storytime episodes, I have no way to be able to prove or disprove an OP's tale of the paranormal. But in this case, we did have a couple of details that I could fact check, so I did. Hurricane Floyd did occur in September of 1999, just as the OP says, and it did cause massive flooding in the Catskills of New York. In fact, 2 fatalities were reported. While this lends credibility in one way to the story, it also makes me question the story at the same time because of one of the statements the OP makes. She says that they bathed in the creek during the time their power was out due to the hurricane. I don't know if you've ever been around a creek after intense flash flooding, but that's not a place you're gonna want to bathe or even go near. I'm going to give the OP the benefit of the doubt and say that she meant after the water had, sort of returned to a more normal level and the current had slowed down, that then maybe they were taking baths in the creek. But still, that kind of storm and flooding stirs up all sorts of debris and dirt, and that's not water you want to bathe in. The OP doesn't really state, how long they were without power total. I believe that she says that it was at the 1 week mark that her sister called. And if there's the kind of flash flooding that I was reading about in the news articles online about this hurricane and the effect it had on the Catskills, in a week's time, those creeks were not down to a point that you could bathe in them. This little tidbit, though, isn't one of the things that really make me question this story and whether or not it's really a true tale of the paranormal. We'll get into that, but it does give me pause because after a flash flood like that, you are not bathing in the creek. These types of stories, ones of phones that aren't connected but yet are working, or getting calls from someone who has passed away, were quite popular in the 90s when I was a teenager. I've actually heard quite a few different stories along these lines involving phones, and I've had a couple of weird phone incidents myself. I don't know that any of mine were paranormal, but, they made these types of stories even more interesting for me personally. We've got to cover a couple of things for my younger listeners here. Back in the day, back in antiquity, especially in rural areas, it wasn't uncommon for wires to get crossed and for you to pick up the phone conversations and hear somebody else's conversation. Nothing paranormal about it at all. It was just something that country folk often had to deal with. The OP references a party line, but if this has a mundane explanation, like if this story is true and it has a mundane explanation, the party line isn't it. I'm not going to explain what a party line was, but I know that this wasn't a party line situation, and you may ask how I know. Well, my grandparents lived out in the country, and even though in the 1990s we were well past the old days of an operator actually connecting calls for you, it wasn't uncommon for wires to still get crossed. And when we'd use my grandparents' landline, we'd sometimes pick up the phone and hear the neighbors on the phone having their conversation. This was a technical glitch that they still dealt with, even into at least the early 90s. Might have gone on a little bit longer. I can't remember exactly when it was fixed. When I asked my grandmother about this as a kid, she said that when the phones were first set up on the hill, which is what the locals called the area where they lived, there was only them and a few neighbors, and they all shared one phone line. There wasn't a phone line for each house. There was a phone line for the hill. They had phone lines to each of their houses. Like, there was a line going, but they all had the same number because the area was so rural that they didn't each get a phone number. This is way back in the day. So if they wanted to make a call, they'd have to pick up the phone in their house and listen for a second or two to see if anyone else was already using the phone and the one number that went to all the houses on the hill before they could actually dial the operator to place their call. It also meant that everyone's phone rang when anyone got a phone call. My grandfather built their house just after World War II, so this gives you an idea of how old the houses were and when the phone lines were originally installed. And I'm fairly certain that by the late 1990s, the phone system in the area had been fixed. It was right around the late 90s, early 2000s. And at that point, they no longer had that issue of sometimes accidentally getting the neighbors' phone calls. But it sounds like the OP was in an even more rural area than my grandparents. So it is possible that something like this could explain why the OP would hear other conversations when she picked up the phone. And one of the voices she hears does say that sometimes the lines do pick up other phone conversations. So it could be a situation like this where it's a very old and outdated phone system that everything's connected to. But again, you know, if it's all because you plug your cordless phone into a phone jack as well. So if it was an issue with the phone lines in the area altogether, the cordless phone, I would think, would have the issue too. The thing that takes us in a more of a paranormal direction is that we ultimately find out that there is only one short wire on the phone, about 3 inches long, and that it isn't actually connected to anything. If the phone's never been connected in the time they've lived there, then how are they hearing anything? That makes us question if this could be something paranormal. But the more I contemplate this story, the more questions and doubt I have. When the OP says her sister called, she says they heard an unfamiliar ring. She says they preferred to use their cordless phone, but if the phone had been hooked up at all, the one in the kitchen on the wall, it should have rang every time their cordless phone did. And even if they just opted not to use the wall phone, they would have been familiar with its ring since it would have rang any time their cordless phone did. If the wall phone never rang at any other time, a normal person would have questioned why it rang that one and only time when the power was out during the hurricane. And likely you would have investigated the matter right then. You're not going to have a phone ring that has never rung before and not question the heck out of that. Or at least I know I'd have been questioning it. Like if that phone had never rang before and all of a sudden the power's out and that phone rings, I'm going to be looking into that because that is some suspicious stuff. Which leads to the very first big question I had. Normally with these stories, it's a spirit calling, not an actual living, breathing person. If it was a spirit calling after the hurricane, then wouldn't the OP's sister have been shocked when the OP and her family showed up at her place? Like, wouldn't there have been questions? Or are we going with the idea that it was actually the sister on the phone inviting them to her place, but that somehow the spirits or the paranormal made the wall phone work so that a living person could call them? The second seems more unlikely to me, at least in the vein of the spirit calls and all of the stories around haunted phones. But that's just my personal opinion. And then to add to this, right, so if we're going on the theory that the paranormal made it possible for her sister to get in touch with her, like maybe we could make a case that this was so important that spirit intervened and made sure that the call got through. But she says that she had used the wall phone a handful of times before this. Spirit is not going to intervene so that you can call living, breathing people on a phone that isn't connected just for the heck of it. Like, okay, hurricane, big emotional thing, maybe we could make a case that Spirit would intervene, but Spirit is not intervening so you can make your hair appointment. Like, it's just not going to work like that. So that kind of makes me question some things too. Here's the last thing that I have a question about. And this is a really big one, right? Because this claim is what really makes me question the OP's credibility, right? So when the husband drove up the road to the store and called AT&T, they supposedly told him that they had no phone hooked up in the OP's kitchen. The phone company can tell if an address has a working phone number assigned to it, but the phone company doesn't have a way to know which phone jacks in your house do or do not actually have a phone plugged into them. Even in the early 2000s, AT&T wouldn't have had a clue as to which phone jacks their house did or didn't have a phone plugged in to them. There's no way to know that. They do not know, there was not a database, right, where you could call up the phone company and be like, oh, how many phone jacks are in my house? How many of them are actually in use? They didn't have that information. They might have a work record, like if you say you moved into a house and it only had one phone jack, right? Because it was an old house and you wanted to have a phone jack installed in another room, then the phone company might have a work order record because you've had to call the phone company, pay them to have somebody come out to install another phone jack. Then they might have an idea as to where specifically phone jacks are in your house, but they are not going to know whether or not you had a phone actually physically hooked up to a jack or not in your home. And because the OP makes this claim, this is what really just sinks the OP ship for me, because there is no way that AT&T would have had any clue whether or not the phone was hooked up or not. While I love a good paranormal story about mysterious phone calls, and I can't prove or disprove the OP's story, I think there's a few too many questions here, and I'm not inclined to take this story as anything more than a good campfire story. You might ask, if I'm not buying this OP story, why I'm even telling it. Well, like I said, I think it's a good campfire story, but also I think this is a really good example of how whenever we're presented, even though I am a firm believer in the paranormal, I've had many experiences, I think that this is a good example of, we need to remain critical and really look for mundane explanations or gaping holes in the story that make something improbable, because, a lot of times we get taken in by a good yarn, but if we stop to really examine it, we can tell it's a yarn more than a true tale of the paranormal. What are your thoughts, though? If this was paranormal, do you think the spirits put the sister's call through, or do you think it was a spirit calling? If you think it's paranormal, why, what was going on for those other handful of conversations she had on that phone? What's your explanation? What's your, theory behind why that could possibly have worked and been paranormal? Who were the spirits of the other voices that the OP would hear on the phone when she picked it up? Do you think they were paranormal? Do you think she was picking up something else? I mean, the wire supposedly was never connected. So if the story is true, what do you think that the OP was hearing? Do you think there's a mundane explanation for the story? Do you think it's nothing more than a campfire tale? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because I'd love to hear from you and what your thoughts are on the story. I will be doing more story time, so if you've got a true tale of the paranormal that you'd like me to consider for an episode, please use my email in the description box to send me your story for consideration. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And until I see you again, stay spooky.